The swinging doors of the Dusty Spur Saloon groaned on their hinges, a sound like a dying animal that cut through the low murmur of the afternoon crowd. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer, sawdust, and the lingering acridity of cheap tobacco. Grant leaned against the far wall, a shadow in a room full of noise, his hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. He was a man of significant means, owning the sprawling double-bar ranch that stretched across the valley floor to the foothills, yet he wore the dust of the trail as comfortably as his skin. He held a glass of whiskey he had no intention of finishing, his attention fixed on the commotion rising near the bar. The barkeep, a man with a face like a clenched fist, was shouting, his finger pointed toward the exit with a jagged authority that brooked no argument. Standing before the bar was a woman, slight in stature but rigid with a dignity that seemed out of place among the spilled spirits and rough laughter. She was Chinese, her dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a dress that had seen better seasons but was mended with meticulous care. She did not shout back. She did not weep. She simply held a small bundle to her chest, her knuckles white, absorbing the vitriol as a stone absorbs the rain. The barkeep's voice rose, speaking of debts unpaid by a husband now 6 months in the ground, and of a refusal to serve her kind. He reached out, shoving her shoulder, a physical breach that silenced the room. She stumbled back, the heel of her boot catching on the uneven floorboards, and nearly fell, catching herself against a table where men laughed and pulled their drinks away as if she were contagious. Grant set his glass down. The sound was not loud, yet it carried a finality that seemed to drop the temperature in the room. He pushed off the wall, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the timber floor, the silver spurs chiming a low warning. The crowd parted, not out of courtesy, but out of an instinctual recognition of a predator higher on the food chain. He stopped between the woman and the door, his large frame blocking the harsh afternoon light. He looked at the barkeep, then at the woman, seeing the tremble in her hands she fought so hard to hide. The injustice of it sat in his gut like a stone. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked the barkeep in the eye until the man looked away, muttering about policy and bad luck. Grant turned to the woman, extending a hand not to touch her, but to guide the space around her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble of gravel and earth, "they have no business treating a lady so. Gather your things. Come with me. I'll fill your table tonight." The walk to the buckboard wagon was a study in silence. The town of Oakhaven was waking up from its midday lull, people pausing on the boardwalks to watch the wealthy rancher escort the widow toward the livery. The spring mud sucked at their boots, thick and clinging, a reminder of the heavy rains that had finally broken the winter drought. The air smelled of wet sage and new growth, a sharp, clean scent that contrasted with the stale confinement of the saloon. Grant helped her into the passenger seat of the wagon. She hesitated, her dark eyes scanning his face for deceit, searching for the cruelty she had come to expect from men in this territory. Finding only a stoic blankness, a face carved from the same granite as the mountains behind them, she accepted his hand. Her grip was calloused, the skin rough. A worker's hand, he noted. She was no stranger to labor. Grant climbed up beside her, taking the leather reins in his gloved hands. He clicked his tongue, and the two bays lurched forward, pulling the wagon out of the muck and onto the main road leading west. For a long time, the only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of hooves, the creak of the wagon springs, and the wind rustling through the tall, greening grass of the plains. The sky above was a bruising purple and gold, the sun beginning its descent behind the peaks, casting long, melancholy shadows across the valley. Grant felt the weight of her presence beside him. He was a man used to solitude, a man who had built an empire on silence and hard work. Bringing a stranger home, particularly a woman, was a disruption to the carefully ordered isolation of his life. Yet, leaving her there on the street had not been an option. He respected fact, and the fact was she would have starved or frozen without intervention. She sat with her back straight, looking forward, refusing to slump into the seat. "My name is May," she said softly, the words barely carrying over the wind. It was not an introduction so much as an assertion of existence. Grant nodded, keeping his eyes on the horizon where his land began. "Grant," he replied. "Grant Moore." He didn't ask about her husband or the debt. Those were yesterdays. He was concerned with the tonight and the tomorrow. The road began to climb, the air growing cooler as they ascended toward the plateau where his ranch house stood. It was a sturdy structure, built of timber and stone, meant to withstand storms, not to invite guests. As the house came into view, silhouetted against the dying light, he saw it through her eyes for a moment. Imposing, lonely, and silent. He wondered if he had made a mistake, bringing a bird with a broken wing to a wolf's den, but he pushed the thought away. The decision was made. The interior of the ranch house was dark and cold, the fire in the great stone hearth having burned down to gray ash hours ago. Grant ushered May inside, striking a match against the rough stone of the mantel to light a kerosene lamp. The golden glow flared to life, revealing a room that was utilitarian and sparse. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the hardwood floors, only heavy furniture built for function. Dust motes danced in the sudden light. He saw May shiver, a small tremor that ran through her shoulders, and immediately moved to the hearth. He knelt, his movements efficient and practiced, arranging kindling and logs with the care of a man who viewed fire not as a luxury, but as a necessary companion. Within minutes the flames were licking upward, casting dancing orange shadows against the walls and driving the damp spring chill from the air. "Sit," Grant commanded gently, gesturing to the armchair nearest the warmth. He did not wait for her to comply before turning toward the kitchen area. This was his domain, usually silent save for the scrape of a fork on a tin plate. Now he felt a pressure to perform, to fulfill the promise he had made in the saloon. He opened the larder, taking out a slab of cured beef, a sack of potatoes, and a jar of preserved peaches. He worked with a rhythmic precision, slicing the potatoes into the cast iron skillet, the sound of the knife against the cutting board loud in the quiet house. He could feel her watching him from the other room, her gaze a physical weight on his back. He did not try to fill the silence with idle chatter. In his experience, words were often used to mask intentions, whereas actions laid them bare. The smell of frying beef and onions soon filled the house, a savory, grounding aroma that seemed to loosen the tension in the room. When he plated the food, he gave her the larger portion, placing it on the rough-hewn table. "Eat," he said, pouring water from a pitcher into 2 tin cups. May approached the table slowly. She did not sit immediately. She looked at the food, then at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked, the single word heavy with suspicion. Grant sat down, picking up his fork. "You were hungry. I had food. The math is simple." He began to eat, signaling that the conversation was over, or at least that no debt was being tallied in a ledger she couldn't see. She sat then, and after the first tentative bite, she ate with a focus that spoke of long days without a proper meal. Grant watched her hands, steady, capable, breaking the bread with respect. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, and for the first time in years, the empty chair across from him didn't feel like a void. Morning arrived with the pale, washed-out light of early spring, filtering through the uncurtained windows to touch the floorboards with stripes of gray and white. Grant was awake before the sun, a habit ingrained by decades of ranch life. He had slept in the bunkhouse, giving May the main house for privacy, a gesture he hadn't explained but simply done. Walking across the yard, the mud crunching under his boots, he surveyed his land. The green shoots of grass were pushing up through the damp earth, vibrant and insistent. The cattle in the near pasture were lowing softly, their breath misting in the cold air. It was a time of renewal, of waking up, and he felt a strange resonance with the season as he approached his own back door. He hesitated with his hand on the latch, unused to knocking on his own home, then pushed it open. May was already awake. She had not only risen, but had made the bed he had offered her, the blankets pulled tight and smooth, the pillows beaten into shape. She stood by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of the valley, her posture rigid. She turned as he entered, her face composed. "I cannot pay you," she stated flatly. It was the first thing she said, a continuation of her thought from the night before. She was drawing a line, protecting her pride. Grant removed his hat, hanging it on the peg by the door. "I didn't ask for payment," he replied, moving to the stove to check the coffee pot. It was cold. He hadn't started it yet. "But I don't take charity," she countered, her voice firm, though her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "I work. I earn my keep." Grant stopped and looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and the fear she was keeping at bay with sheer will. He needed a housekeeper, truthfully. The house was falling into a state of bachelor neglect that he had stopped noticing until she stepped inside. He needed someone to manage the garden he kept meaning to plant, to mend the clothes he wore until they fell apart. "It's a big house," Grant said slowly, pouring water into the coffee pot. "Too big for one man to keep right. And the garden, the soil is turned, but the seeds sit in the shed. I lose hours every day cooking and cleaning when I should be with the herd." He turned to face her, leaning his hip against the counter. "Room and board, a fair wage at the end of the month. In exchange, you manage the house. You cook. You keep the garden." It was a business proposition, clean and dry. May studied him for a long moment, assessing the contract. "I cook," she agreed. "I clean. And I plant." She nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Deal." The terms set, the dynamic of the house shifted immediately. It was no longer a shelter for a guest. It was a workplace, and May wasted no time proving her worth. As soon as a simple breakfast of oats and coffee was finished, she began. Grant went out to the barn to attend to a mare that had thrown a shoe, but he found himself glancing back at the house more often than usual. He saw the windows fly open to let out the stale winter air. He saw a rug being beaten over the porch railing, the dust flying out in great clouds to be carried away by the prairie wind. For a man who lived his life outdoors, the activity within the house felt foreign, yet strangely settling. It was as if the house itself was taking a deep breath after holding it for years. When Grant returned at midday for water, he found the kitchen transformed. It was not just clean, it was scrubbed. The grease that had coated the stove for years was gone, the black metal gleaming dully. The table had been wiped down so thoroughly the grain of the wood seemed to stand out in higher relief. May was on her knees near the hearth, scrubbing the stone with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff brush, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were slender but corded with muscle. She didn't look up as he entered, her focus entirely on the task at hand. The rhythmic shh, shh of the brush was the only sound. Grant stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own home, but also feeling a profound sense of respect. He walked to the sink, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He took the dipper from the water bucket and drank, watching her work. She was thorough, attacking the dirt with a vengeance that suggested she was scrubbing away not just grime, but the memory of the saloon, the humiliation, and the fear. "You don't have to do it all in a day," he said, his voice low. May paused, sitting back on her heels to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked up at him, her eyes bright and fierce. "Dirt waits for no one," she said, "and I like to see the stone." Grant nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. He respected labor, and he respected the pride taken in it. He set the dipper down. "There's venison for supper," he said. "I'll bring it in from the smokehouse." It was a small offering, a contribution to the partnership. She nodded, accepting it, and returned to her scrubbing. As Grant walked back out into the bright spring sunshine, the house behind him felt less like a tomb and more like a place where life might actually take root. Weeks bled into a month, and the rhythm of the Double Bar Ranch shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with the undeniable force of a river changing course. The spring deepened, the gray skies of March giving way to the volatile, heavy blues of April. The garden, once a patch of neglected, weed-choked earth near the kitchen door, had been transformed into a grid of military precision. May fought a war against the encroaching prairie grass with a hoe and a determination that Grant watched from the periphery of his vision. He would ride out at dawn, the air crisp and smelling of wet loam, and see her already bent over the furrows, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat she had salvaged from the barn, tied under her chin with a scrap of twine. Grant never spoke to her while she worked. He respected the concentration required to coax life from the stubborn soil, but he found himself riding the perimeter fence closer to the house than was strictly necessary. One evening, returning with dust coating his throat and the ache of a 12-hour day in his lower back, he found the garden gate hanging crookedly on a rusted hinge. It was a small thing, a nuisance he had ignored for years, simply lifting the gate to drag it open. He stopped, looking at the fresh green shoots of peas and beans May had coaxed from the ground, vulnerable to any wandering rabbit or deer. Without entering the house to wash up, Grant walked to the workshop. He emerged with a hammer, a handful of fresh nails, and new leather strips. The sun was setting, casting the yard in a bruised purple light. He dismantled the old hinge, the metal screeching in protest, and set to work. He didn't hear May come out onto the porch. He only knew she was there by the sudden stillness that felt different from the empty air. He aligned the gate, hammering the leather into place with rhythmic, heavy strokes. When he finished, the gate swung silent and true, clicking shut with a satisfying finality. He turned to find her watching him, a basket of laundry on her hip. "Rabbits," he said, by way of explanation, gesturing to the gate with the hammer. May looked at the gate, then up at him, her eyes dark and reflecting the last of the light. "Thank you," she said. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a treaty signed. The spring storms rolled in off the mountains with the violence of a temperamental god, shaking the timbers of the ranch house and turning the world into a blur of vertical gray water. It was a night where the wind howled like a living thing, testing every seam and joint of the structure. Grant sat by the fire, mending a bridle, the leather strip passing through his fingers with a soothing friction. May was across the room, darning a sock, the needle flashing in the firelight. The domestic quiet was shattered by a frantic whinny from the barn, cutting through the roar of the wind. Grant's head snapped up. "The mare," he said, already rising. The bay mare was close to foaling, and the drop in pressure had likely triggered labor. He grabbed his oilskin coat and the lantern. "I'll need hot water," he said, not asking, but stating a necessity. May was already moving to the stove before he had the door open. "Go," she said. "I follow." The barn was a cavern of shadows, and the smell of sweet hay and nervous animal sweat. The mare was down in the straw, her sides heaving, eyes rolling white in the lantern light. Grant hung the lamp on a high hook and stripped off his coat, rolling his sleeves up his thick forearms. The foal was twisted. He could tell by the angle of the mare's distress. He worked with a calm urgency, his voice a low, steady stream of nonsense words meant to soothe the beast. The barn door creaked open, admitting a gust of rain, and May. She struggled with a steaming bucket of water, her hair plastered to her skull, her dress soaked to the knees. She did not shrink from the sight of the blood or the visceral reality of the birth. She set the bucket down and knelt in the straw beside him. "What do I do?" she asked. Her voice was steady, cutting through the panic of the horse. "Hold her head," Grant commanded. "Keep her down. Talk to her." For an hour they fought for the life of the foal. May's small hand stroked the mare's velvet nose, her voice a melodic murmur in a language Grant didn't understand but felt in his chest, a sound like water over stones. Grant used his strength and his knowledge, guiding the foal, turning the legs, sweating despite the chill of the storm. When the foal finally slid free, wet and glistening, collapsing into the straw with a wet thud, the relief in the barn was palpable. The mare nickered, a low, guttural sound of recognition. Grant sat back on his heels, his hands slick, his chest heaving. He looked at May. She was stroking the mare's neck, her face smeared with mud and straw, her eyes shining with a fierce triumph. She looked at him, and for the first time, the guard was down. There was no employer, no employee, just two creatures who had wrestled life from the storm. Grant reached out, his hand hovering, then rested his heavy, bloodied hand on her shoulder. He squeezed, once, firmly. "Good work," he rasped. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, just for a second, before the moment broke. The trip to town 2 weeks later was a necessity Grant usually dreaded, but this time the wagon felt different. May sat beside him, wearing a bonnet she had fashioned from scrap fabric, her posture as upright as a church spire. The town of Oakhaven watched them pass, the curtains twitching, the men on the boardwalk pausing their whittling to stare. The gossip had run its course and settled into a hard sediment of judgment. Grant pulled the wagon up to the general store, the brake lever ratcheting loud in the quiet street. He helped May down, his hand lingering on her elbow a fraction of a second longer than politeness dictated, a silent claim of protection visible to anyone with eyes. Inside the store, the air smelled of coffee beans and pickle brine. The shopkeeper, a man named Vance with eyes like beads, nodded stiffly. "Grant," he said, ignoring May entirely. Grant moved to the counter, placing his order with a flat, booming voice. Flour, sugar, coffee, nails. While Vance scurried to fill the list, Grant watched May. She had moved to the fabric section, her fingers hovering over a bolt of soft, sky-blue calico. She didn't touch it, her hands remained clasped at her waist, but her eyes drank in the color. It was a luxury, something frivolous for a woman who owned 2 dresses, both mended. She turned away, moving to look at the sacks of lentils. Grant turned back to Vance. "And the blue cloth," Grant said, pointing a calloused finger. "The whole bolt." Vance paused, his eyebrows shooting up. "That's fine weave, Grant. Pricey." Grant merely stared at him, his face a stone mask. "Did I ask the price?" he rumbled. Vance swallowed and pulled the bolt down. When they loaded the wagon, Grant placed the wrapped bolt of fabric on the seat between them. May looked at it, then at him, her brow furrowed. "This is not on the list," she said. "It is not for the house." Grant climbed up, taking the reins. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ears of the horses. "The house needs color," he said obstinately. "And the work you do, it earns more than room and board. Consider it a bonus." He clicked his tongue to the team, and the wagon lurched forward. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her hand reach out and rest on the brown paper wrapping of the fabric. Her fingers stroked it gently. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The silence between them had changed quality again. It was no longer the silence of strangers, nor the silence of co-workers. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of a shared secret. Night fell over the valley, quiet and vast. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, casting a deep, red warmth across the floorboards. Supper had been eaten, a stew May had made with the fresh herbs from her garden, savory and rich, and the plates were cleared. Grant sat in his armchair, a book open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. May sat near the lamp, the blue calico spread over her knees. She was measuring, cutting, her movements precise and graceful. The snip of her shears was the only sound in the room. The domesticity of it hit Grant with the force of a physical blow. He realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that he could no longer imagine this room without her in it. The thought of the empty chair, the cold stove, the silence before she arrived. It was a hollow ache he hadn't known he was carrying until it was gone. He watched her thread a needle, her eyes narrowing in concentration. She pricked her finger, a tiny hiss of breath escaping her lips. She brought the finger to her mouth, sucking on the bead of blood. Grant leaned forward, the book forgotten. "Let me see," he said. The words were out before he could weigh them. May looked up, surprised, then slowly lowered her hand. She extended it toward him. Grant reached out, his large, rough hand engulfing hers. Her skin was warm, smooth despite the calluses of the garden. He inspected the tiny red mark on her fingertip. It was nothing, a trifle, but he didn't let go. He ran his thumb over her knuckles, feeling the delicate bones beneath. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a tension that hummed like a telegraph wire. Her eyes were wide, searching his face, stripping away the layers of stoicism he wore like armor. "May," he said, her name sounding rough in his throat. He didn't know what he wanted to say. He wasn't a man of words. He wanted to say that she had filled the table and the house and the hollow parts of him. Instead, he simply held her hand, anchoring her to him, anchoring himself to the earth. "Be careful," he murmured. "I need those hands." The morning of the reckoning came with a knock at the door, not a guest's knock, but the heavy, entitled pounding of authority. Grant opened it to find a courier from the bank in the city, a man looking dusty and out of place in a crisp suit. He held a ledger. May stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her face paling as she recognized the nature of the visitor. She stepped forward, her spine stiffening. "If this is about the debt," she began, her voice trembling slightly but clear, "I have wages saved. I can pay an installment." The courier looked at her, then at Grant, confused. "Debt?" the man asked. "Ma'am, the debt on the estate of Mr. Chin was cleared 3 weeks ago. I'm here for the deed transfer signature, the claim on the adjacent lot." May froze. She turned her head slowly to look at Grant. He was standing by the door, his face impassive, looking at the horizon as if the weather were the only thing of interest. The courier continued. "Mr. Moore wired the funds to the central branch. Principal and interest. Clean slate." Silence descended on the room, heavier than the storm, heavier than the night. Grant signed the paper the man thrust at him, dismissed him with a nod, and closed the door. He didn't turn around immediately. He listened to the courier's horse gallop away. When he finally turned, May was standing exactly where she had been, tears standing in her eyes, not falling, just magnifying the dark intensity of her gaze. "You paid it," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "Why?" Grant walked over to the table, resting his hands on the back of a chair. "A man can't work with a shadow hanging over him," he said, using the logic of the ranch to explain the logic of the heart. "And I couldn't have you looking over your shoulder when you should be looking at the garden." He paused, taking a breath that rattled slightly in his chest. "You're free, May. The debt is gone. You can go where you like. The city, east." He waited, his heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against his ribs, waiting for her to take the freedom he had bought her. May took a step toward him, then another. She stopped with the table between them. She placed her hands flat on the wood, mirroring him. "The contract," she said. "It was for work, for room and board." Grant nodded. "Contract's done. You don't owe me a thing." May shook her head slowly. "The garden is not finished. The peas are flowering, but the beans are not ready." She looked down at her hands, then up at him, her expression softening into something luminous and rare. "And the table," she said, her voice dropping to a hush. "You said you would fill my table. You did." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "I do not wish to go east. I do not wish to be free of this house." Grant turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, locking them together. The grip was tight, desperate, and final. "Then stay," he said, his voice cracking. "Stay and fill the house." She nodded, a single tear finally escaping to track down her cheek. "I stay," she whispered. Outside, the sun broke over the peaks, flooding the valley with golden light, burning off the morning mist, illuminating the land that was no longer lonely.